You're back. Good. Thank you for tuning in to How's This, a series of programs that asks the question, what? The Massachusetts State Legislature has suggested that we urbanize all of eastern Massachusetts, the 176 towns served by the MBTA, producing approximately 360,000 units of new housing over the next generation, and Newton's share would be 8,000 new multifamily housing units, apartments, 800 of which are being constructed just down the street from our TV studio right now. And Newton's response so far has been, yes, let's grow our town's population, crowd the areas around T stations, upzone our 13 village centers, ideas that are so far from understanding the reality of one of Boston's greenest suburbs, Newton, whose very name brings up the thoughts of Garden City. What? We're just hoping to apply Newton's law here. Yeah, Isaac Newton. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Here today with a bit of reaction is Newton architect Mark Hirschman. Me, I'm Jeff Stein, also an architect. Okay, that's two architects. And joining us, as he has for every one of these discussions, is architect Robert Fizek. Because what could be better than two architects? Three architects. Remember that next time you're thinking about your house renovation or corporate headquarters. More is better, yes. So, if you've tuned into one of our earlier discussions, you know that the issues are wide-ranging. You can't just build housing without thinking of energy, carbon footprint, infrastructure. Where's all that electricity going to come from? Where's the sewage going to? Transportation, schools, the continuing spread of COVID, where the jobs actually are. Oh, and here's a hint. They're not just in downtown Boston anymore. Everything is connected. So today, we want to focus on one big issue, upzoning, and what it means for just one of Newton's villages, Nonantum. Okay, ready? Robert?
Yeah.
What is upzoning anyway?
Well, upzoning is a process of municipalities, regions, sometimes planning to concentrate their population and new growth in certain patterns. In this case, as you mentioned, it's around the transportation system. It would be great if that transportation system were worthy of such plans, and it itself were planned to be worthy of this growth. One of the problems is we haven't seen any of that yet. So we're kind of maybe going cart before horse, and this is where we're at here in Newton these days.
So there's zoning in which a municipality gives the rules about what can be built, and over many years, several generations in Newton, that has been what we have lived with, and we have built these 13 village centers, and we have buildings that we're familiar with and businesses that exist in them. And now we're talking about upzoning those areas.
Right. Yeah, there's a pattern. There's a context. As you mentioned, the Garden City built over several generations, and the reason why most of us had come to move here, the green streets, once reasonably priced housing, and good schools, etc., is being challenged to conform to a new paradigm.
Yeah, a new paradigm, a new reality, really. There's the reality of Newton and why we all live here, and that could change.
Yeah, that's not to say that there aren't opportunities to do this. And one typically would do this through a very careful and deliberate planning process, to which you would design your zoning to accommodate the growth that's appropriate to the context that you're in. We're, again, doing it backwards.
Oh, yeah, and in part because, of course, there hasn't ever been growth for the last decade in Newton. In fact, we've lost population in this town over the last 2 censuses.
Yeah, but on the other hand, we've already permitted 10% of our number of housing units for construction here. So we've permitted already somewhere around 3,000 something units to be built already.
Wow. So if we build it, will they come?
Well, if you have enough money, I suppose that's the case. And affordability, which is often mentioned and promised in this proposition, is something that is hardly ever delivered in any significant numbers.
Oh, yes, and according to the Massachusetts State Legislature, that's not one of the issues that governs these 360,000 units meant to be built in eastern Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Affordability isn't one of the rules.
No, they strangely avoided incorporating that.
Hmm.
And in fact, Newton's inclusionary zoning was in excess of the state's minimum standards.
Great. Well, Mark, let's talk about Nonantum and show us a little bit of it.
Very good. So Nonantum is one of the villages. All of the villages are being upzoned, and so we could begin to look at what they are suggesting in Nonantum.
And let's remember that this is not one of the MBTA zones. This is,
Right. What's fascinating is it's just some paradigm to let's build bigger. Let's turn it urban. Let's not just be Garden City. Let's just be city. And so what we're going to look at is how they first presented their paradigm and what transpired
just to be-
and some visuals.
just to be clear, they,
Yes.
when you say they, you mean the Zoning and Planning Committee.
Correct.
of the
They
city.
being the Zoning Planning Committee, a subset of the council, and the Planning Department.
Thank you.
In prior situations, they had more input from professionals, people in real estate, contractors and architects, lawyers. That didn't happen in this process. Okay, so what they are going through is they went through version 1, 2, and 3. Of course, they wanted to just finish it version 1 perhaps, but this map is showing version 1, and at least in version 1 you can see the scale of the houses and you could see the areas that are being impacted.
So these little gray squares, rectangles, we're looking at a bird's eye view of what's built in Nonantum already.
Correct.
Right? This is under the current zoning rules that have been in place for years, and we've built out, and there we are.
So we have a built community, and the question is, to what extent do you really choose to and want to transform it? So what's their suggestion? They want to change for 1-story retail, 1- and 2-story retail, to what's called VC2, which is 3.5-story buildings. VC1 would have been an upgrade, an upzoning of density of residences to structures that would have changed a single-family parcel to 10 or 20 units on a parcel. That, from our pushback, has been diminished, and they transformed that zone to what's called MRT. Whether we get to discussing MRT or not, we could maybe just brush a little bit on that. But fortunately, advocacy from professionals such as ourselves has made some impact, but not nearly enough.
So this is the center that we're looking at of Nonantum, and this is all these blue squares around the blocks and the existing buildings. That's showing what could be upzoned.
Exactly. And all of Watertown Street, and we'll take a look at what Watertown Street looks like now and what it could look like with this VC2. We're going to take a look at that and whether that's really appropriate. The community, as we are finding, does not think so, and they are quite vocal now And that again can be discussed they're out in the public square discussing these proposals, and they're not very favorable to it.
And that's-
Neither are the businesses.
That's the community, once they did actually find out that this was,
Oh, yeah, once they found out, because in the democracy that we have in Newton, this has all been a little behind closed doors, this work.
well, let's say the doors may be open, but no one knows when those doors are open for public debate. They generally have not been through the process. And once they have been open to public debate, you get your little 2 minutes.
So if I own a 1 or 2 story building in Nonantum, and now with upzoning, I get to put 2 more stories on it, isn't that good? Aren't I going to make a lot of money doing this as residential?
Someone is going to make a lot of money. Now, it remains to be seen what that means to the people who actually live in Nonantum, and they see a gentrification scheme in.
Well, it's gentrification, but it's also an issue of structure, right? If I have a 1-story building, it has foundations and walls and columns and a roof that's meant to hold maybe a little snow load, but not 2 more stories of building.
No, it's not like you can add stories on top of existing buildings. That generally is almost impossible.
So what does upzoning mean? It means, sounds like it means destroying the fabric that we have already and building something entirely new that we can afford to build.
Yes, and these days it'll be larger in size, and according to our zoning professionals, it will be taller, significantly taller, and there's your density.
I guess I could imagine that. Maybe show us something.
Right, and hugely disruptive, and perhaps for years. So from version 1, where we saw the scale of the structures, for some reason they felt maybe we don't have to show the community the fabric or the specifics of what really is within these parcels. And so they just use colors, and version 2 is shown in just a more graphic way, where we no longer see the parcels.
So this is all the area that is scheduled to be upzoned according to the current plan.
Yes, and so version 3, in the course of these 3 versions, there have been some major and minor tweaking of what they were preferring to do. Now, this is a view of version 3. In the title, you could see it says changes from version 2. So that's significant. As opposed for me to show you just what version 3 is, this is much clearer to really allow the public to see what they did.
So a little area of this, the red area, for instance, gets to be even bigger than the previous version?
Precisely. And this happened at the 11th hour, when they were just about going to press on the whole scheme. They upzoned a major area on Watertown Street. It was bad enough to be 3.5 stories, which in essence is 4-story buildings, to 4.5-story buildings, in essence 5-story buildings, without any community input whatsoever.
Well, once we have a little community input, which I hope we have really soon, is this going to even be possible? I mean, who's going to stand for their building and business being destroyed to build a 2 times taller building on the site that they were making a living off of?
Well, that's the unfortunate thing of legislation that hasn't been clearly thought through with the community. And so I presume, and there is a lot of outrage actually from business owners and from community, that not only is this way too big, but we weren't even consulted. If they were consulted, the outrage probably would have been more extensive.
And again, the village center zoning is not the MBTA, the required state legislated housing program. None of this counts towards the numbers that are required there.
This is just,
Interesting.
this is just
Yeah.
increasing
And
density.
that is true
and,
in many places.
Perhaps a windfall for some developer, but most importantly, the community and the business owners are really, for the most part, saying, we really don't need this. We like our community. They like their bake shops. They like their community shops that they're familiar with, and we'll take a look at the images of what the community's like and what it might look
Yeah.
like if transformed. So shall
Good,
we?
yeah. let's
and,
see
and
it.
just to give a broader picture of the community, they're being amenable to growth, but it was suggested by the community that there are commercial properties behind the main street, the village center, pretty significant parcels. Look there. Look to other parcels that are similarly infill. Don't slam this down on top of what we love about our community. And this has been a community that has welcomed. This is one of the most diverse areas in Newton, and one of the least areas of lower income, lower and moderate income, and all of that is threatened by speculation and development.
Right. It's definitely Newton. Though Nonantum, you can't confuse it with Somerville, for instance. Somerville looks a certain way. Newton, even in Nonantum, looks a certain way, and we're comfortable with that.
The interesting thing is the MRT scheme is really a paradigm very close to Somerville. So actually, when they get into the neighborhoods with the residential low scale, it's again densification, smaller structures packed closer together. Again, another transformation of the look and feel in
Yeah.
Newton. So without further ado, we'll take a look at some of the streetscapes. So we're going to start down the block. We're going to be taking a walk through Watertown Street. And here we're a view from what's about 332 Watertown Street. And we're looking at the smaller scale 1 to 2.5 story structures, active retail. People are familiar with the stores. And this whole street area is being upzoned for 3.5 story, in essence, 4-story buildings.
So this is what is possible, given the new upzoning rules, to build on this site in Watertown Street, Nonantum.
Right. And then what happens? You get a canyon effect. You get less light, less focus on the retail, more noise, congestion, just the noise of the canyon effect of just whether it's street traffic or trash collection. There's a greater vibration of sound when you have walls like this on each side of the street.
And this
we
is
should-
residential, and so who are the residents? Who are we building this for exactly anyway? It doesn't look like it's going to be for families with 2 children.
The
There's no
proposal,
requirement.
right?
There's really no criteria for that.
Some of the MBTA proposal is suggesting for families, but
This is not there.
who's to decide and define what that actually is? The reality is the scale and the size of the units in multifamily housing, such as apartments, are way smaller than a small home. And New England and our Garden City is based on smaller scale homes, single family, 2-family, and 3-family homes.
Oh, and all these homes have access to outdoors and to green spaces directly on the other side of the wall. And so there are health issues involved here too.
Right. These buildings don't provide that at all.
And by the way, parking is not required.
Right. So talking about congestion.
Parking, yeah. So what is this statistic? 90% of Americans have access to a car. That's 300 million of us, and there are people who have more than one car apparently, because there are like 400 million cars in the country, and there's people are going to have cars. Gosh, even the so-called smart growth contingency around building within a half-a-mile radius of a T station isn't exactly that smart for a couple of reasons. One is the noisy and carcinogenic spewing diesel trains that are going right by your apartment building, and the second is because the MBTA, the whole notion of commuter rail or subways, was really interesting, a huge idea 125 years ago. We're celebrating the 125th anniversary this year of the MBTA, and back then the jobs were in Boston, and people would go into the central business district, and then they'd come back out and join the family in the green and leafy suburb, and have dinner and sleep and get up the next day and go to the train station and go in. Over the last several years especially, but even a little bit before that, the COVID pandemic changed how Americans work. And in fact, so many of us work from home now. The T has lost huge ridership because of people working from home, educating their children at home, or working somewhere else out here in the suburban areas, so that the central business district, like the T itself, is an idea that used to be a good one and isn't exactly such a great idea anymore. And the way you can tell is that during the pandemic, the T received over $2 billion worth of tax money from the federal government, the state and local government, just to keep itself running at 8 miles an hour. Come on. And this year they expect to be $400 million in the red. This notion of a central business district with radiant transportation corridors, if you live here and you work over here, there's no public transportation to get there, and the central business district of Boston right now is a little over 20% vacant, and it's getting a little worse than that, and there are buildings that are being taken off of the tax registers, and we have to have some more serious thought about what housing means in eastern Massachusetts, and especially in Newton. We need some serious thought, and we're not getting much of it so far.
And this paradigm of packing more residents on Main Street is apparently a very questionable idea. Historically, it has not been the desirable tendency, places for people to live on Main Street.
Oh yeah, noisy cars and carbon monoxide right outside your window.
Precisely.
Who thinks that's a good idea?
Precisely. And if you've ever been in an apartment on Main Street, when the bus comes by, that building vibrates. And so these areas will not be vibrant, they will be vibrating. And not just from traffic, all the years of construction and jackhammering and the disruption of existing retail and existing businesses, it would be catastrophic. It's just such a pity that existing businesses that people appreciate will suffer and be gone. So we'll look at some other streetscapes, and here we go. So here's looking in the other direction, and there we'll see what the proposal is. Here you see the 1- and 2-story scale buildings, and that allows light and air. It doesn't create a canyon effect for excessive noise. It has the ability for the trees to feel in scale, growing up towards the sky, but this is what would be proposed. Obviously, the trees are dwarfed, and it's quite unfortunate. So we'll go through further down the street.
You know, it's estimated nationally that municipalities have to replace a third of their street trees every year because the trees die. And in a situation like this, where the building is 3.5 stories tall, and for a good half of the year, those trees aren't getting any sunlight at all because of that, you can see why tree replacement is a big expense.
That's a really good point. We're a garden city, and we are just packing as opposed to figuring out a way to accentuate the positive qualities of Newton as a garden city. So here you have very popular retail establishments, but what's being suggested and legislated, they're very close to legislating this paradigm. 3.5-story buildings. We go further down the street. Again,
And just an
Yes.
observation, I know, technically it's very difficult to put the utilities back on the street, the poles and the wires and everything else, but there's no requirement that those things be undergrounded and erased, as you've been able to do with your illustrations.
yes, yes,
So you'll have that
yes.
cluttering up the street as well.
Yes. So here we have the idea throughout the United States and Europe, 1, 2, and 3-story buildings are the ideal. It's the paradigm for village. And people will say, yes, but there have been 4-story buildings. Yes, but they're not as in scale to community. So let's look at some more. And we're going further down the street. On Watertown Street, there is smaller scale structures, even some residential structures, and they are proposing something way out of scale. Here would be the replacement on the left side, the replacement on the right side. We go further down the street. Why this area isn't protected, the scale of this residential structure that could accommodate some small scale businesses, it's fine. But again, that's slated for demolition.
That's an interesting issue. It's possible not only to protect historic buildings, and some of those residences are historic, but it would be possible to respect and protect the historic pattern of development in that area that people are familiar with, have grown up with, have lived their whole lives with, and continues to actually work.
Absolutely.
Now we should address the big economic proposal here is that if you build more housing, it will get cheaper. Now, problem is we haven't seen that happen in any other high-cost urban area, and if people think that developers are going to just keep on building and building until it gets cheaper, that's not a real thing, because as soon as they get a whiff of there being cost pressures to decrease the rentals or the rental costs, and again, we're talking about rent, we're not talking about ownership, but as soon as they get a whiff that they're reaching that threshold, they'll stop.
Exactly.
Because it's not profitable for them to continue, or it's not profitable enough for them.
It's an interesting issue. The myth out there is that you could build enough housing that it would overwhelm the housing market and prices would drop.
Does not work. If I could give you, let's see if I could try to give you this example. Let's say we have a single family home, and rounded off, you would like some houses are less than $1 million, a little bit more than $1 million, but a typical colonial here in Newton, $1 million, just to keep the numbers simple. You
Crazy.
now allow them with MRT, the new densification in our neighborhoods is suggesting is to allow 4 new units to go in, or transform that unit to 6 units. So let's say you put just 4, and each unit is a condo, and let's say they're really cheap, which they're not going to be this cheap, $500,000. So you have 4 of them. So now you have 4 units at $500,000. You multiply that by 4 $2 million, while the original structure and that parcel was $1 million. So what do the other properties say around this parcel? I could be the same. So there's the gentrification. There's the increase of cost. So adding more units is not going to make it cheaper. It does the inverse, and that's a pity.
And now 4 families are living where 1 family used to live, and so all of a sudden it's 4 times the amount of electricity that's being used, which, by the way, we get from burning diesel fuel number 2 in our electrical power plants. And where's the sewage going to go from 4 families versus 1 family?
Oh, right, of course. And now in Newton, we had rainstorms which were normal, but they led to flooding. So our existing infrastructure cannot accommodate this suggested growth.
This new normal.
Yes, which would be a really terrible new
Yeah,
normal.
we just had 9 inches of rain in
Right.
New York City, for instance, and it flooded everything. And that is going on in this region as well. We can't just rely on the old way of doing things, because things have changed so radically with the climate, with the population, and with who the population is. Baby boomers are retiring and not going to work anywhere anymore, and that's a huge part of New England's population.
Right, remote work. So if there's remote work, you need residences that actually have more space as opposed to small apartments put on Main Street. So if I could quickly just go show the area where they are really upzoning at the 11th hour. So here we are at 421 View, and it's 1, 2, 3 stories at the most. They're planning to do the 4.5-story structures. Talking about a transformation is an understatement. The community hasn't seen this yet, and they are already outraged when they have heard about the plans of changing their beloved mom and pop stores on Main Street
Well,
for excessive development.
Good point.
Why?
They haven't seen it yet. Now, all this so-called planning has been happening with no comprehensive three-dimensional visual representations, nothing certainly that anyone could relate to for an area-wide understanding of what this upzoning proposal means.
So it's like a board game.
That's pretty much how it's gone.
And
And
they
it's taken people like Mark to step in and say, hey, wait a minute, we want to see what this is really like.
And they played this board game at the 11th hour. No community input, discussion whatsoever. And I don't know if their response could be any more intense than what they're feeling currently, but it's quite shocking. So just to see the scale of what they're proposing, we overlaid what's an architectural section, so you can really see in detail. This is very difficult to do, to actually take a slice through a perspective and to show how these numbers really play out. And it is quite shocking. On the left side, they're leaving at 3.5 stories, which is still, as you can see, way too tall, at 44 at the lowest, and 58 feet is as high as they could go with a sloped roof. On the right side is where they upzoned for the 4.5-story, in essence, 5-story buildings, where at the lowest it could be 57 feet, and 71 feet is quite a huge height.
And did we mention by right?
By right, without
Oh, yes,
even
by right. So-
input of community.
There doesn't have to be any sort of public hearings about this stuff. Once
No.
this zoning upgrade is passed, then you could do this without telling anybody.
There may be some design standards. We haven't seen much to tell us what that might be, but By right means by right. I call it by right, B-U-Y.
Yeah, by
Because
right.
that's certainly what the developers will think about it.
So people, professionals, community groups are speaking up, and they have to speak up even louder so they're heard. They need to take a pause. They really need to take a pulse of what's reasonable. And
I would suggest.
this is obviously
And I
a
would
bridge
suggest,
too
I
far.
would suggest they need to think about the city council as it is and whether or not it needs some new blood, some new thinking.
Yeah, it sounds as if the City Council of Newton needs some new thinking. Gosh, in terms of global climate change, half of the carbon in the atmosphere, and whether you think that humans are causing global climate change by digging up fossil fuels, burning them, putting them into the atmosphere, whether that's leading to climate change or not, it's not a great idea to put that stuff into the air. Anyway, in America, about a quarter of the carbon in the atmosphere comes from transportation of all sorts. Planes and cars and boats and motorcycles and trucks, only 1/4. Manufacturing also only about a quarter of the carbon because, of course, much of our manufacturing has gone to China. But buildings, their construction and running them create a little more than half of the carbon in the atmosphere. And here we have a legislation that is proposing to make 360,000 new units of housing, thousands more buildings in little eastern Massachusetts. And at the same time, the governor is trying to outlaw natural gas as a heating solution or the use of oil altogether because of the little amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere from that. This is a real problem. Apparently, the politicians are so behind the times that they haven't come to grips with the fact that we're living in an era of some limits. And that means we have to be more creative and imaginative about real problem issues like housing than we have ever been. And we're not being that yet. This is our challenge.
Yes, very well understood. The demolition of the structures are also such right is a key component of this whole paradigm. To do what they're talking about doing is the demolition of things that are sustainable, usable, rehabable, and are vibrant.
That's
They are
true.
vibrant, but they're active. We don't have to use the word vibrant, because what's going to happen is when they do this, it'll be vibrating. And we don't need our communities vibrating, whether it's through jackhammers or buses that will be vibrating the residences that border a street unnecessarily. We work with what we have, we sustain what we have, and we be modest in what we suggest going forward. And there could be a variety of paradigms, not just housing, a mix of different uses. We don't talk about increasing, if this is about increasing tax base, why not some commercial R&D tax base in Newton? What about that opportunity? And then you could actually, some people may actually be able to walk to work. But that hasn't been pursued at all. So there are better paths, better ways to approach this.
You know, you brought up a really interesting thing that has been overlooked in any of the conversations that I've heard so far about this upzoning, which Robert mentioned. You know, you can't just put 2 more stories on top of your 1-story building. You have to demolish that building, start with new foundations that can hold 3 stories or 3.5 of buildings and all of that stuff. So there's demolition involved. And in fact, the greenest building is the one that's already built. There's so much energy embedded in the building materials, in the bricks and mortar and steel and plaster and wood that is in the existing building. To tear that one down so that you can build one that's twice as big is, and where's all that stuff going to go? We have landfills around eastern Massachusetts that are closing because they're filled. So what, are we going to ship this out to Wyoming? I don't think so. This is a really interesting conundrum that defies reality. There are all of these issues surrounding upzoning that no one is talking about, because once you start talking about them, these are really big problems that need to be solved, and we don't have any solutions for them yet.
Or you get a false comparison. Well, if we don't do this, then what's going to happen is sprawl. And that's always illustrated as going out and mowing down forests.
That paradigm
Everywhere.
has been demonized. The reality is man can commingle with nature. And actually, if we're a little more spread out and leave people with the opportunity to have a little place of their own, be able to have enough area where they could work and live, and access to the ground and do a garden, there is place. This is a big country. Only 6% of the continental United States is built out. That's whether it's cities, suburbs, rural. So there is the room, and we can intermingle with nature in a wise way, especially with remote work. There is a whole lot of opportunity as opposed to packing within the CBD
And
or
you
in the village centers.
And you may have rural communities outside of the metro area that sorely need vitality,
Yes.
vibrancy.
Right, and the land prices out there and the housing prices further west are a little lower and more affordable too.
Absolutely. That's what should be discussed, and that opportunity to the public should be discussed so they aren't limited to this paradigm that's being the focus, and it's not really the
Yeah.
path. It's an old paradigm that, as we discussed, it really isn't a path to go.
Well, let's say that there may be some useful criteria involved, yet the design is so broad and simplistic that it's almost useless unless you do the careful thinking that Jeff is talking about the nature of transportation and where people need to live and work and how they live and work and what they really want to live in.
Right. We're not advocates against the city. It's where appropriate. And if you want city, you build city, and you do it in a way that makes sense, that is sustainable. But to transform a paradigm of a garden city to city does not make sense. Doesn't make sense in our day. And there are much better paths to work with what we have. That's what we as architects can bring to the table. It's called contextual design. You respond to what's there. You take the best examples of what's there, but you don't transform what's there.
Plus, there's an identity issue here in that when you say the word Newton, it brings a certain vision into your mind, and that Newton has an identity, and it's a really lovely one as well. And gosh, what's the reason that we want to transform that into something else? I haven't heard that really.
It's a
Except
numbers
that
game.
some politicians who are not urban planners themselves and who don't, for the most part, live in dense apartment buildings within a half-mile radius of a T-stop. I wonder why that is. Have in mind that this might be a good thing because they heard about it years ago and it sounded good then, and they haven't thought it through quite yet. Remember, citizens, Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. If you're watching this, you live in Newton, and never before has Newton needed your voice the way it does now. So speak up. Say what you like about Newton and how you would like to keep it that way for you, your children, your neighbors, and see what happens then. Thanks.